Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. In case you're new here, my name's Jennifer, and we are back with part 2 of our series that is recapping the 2022 gardening season. Now, in my video a couple days ago, I talked about my 7 biggest garden fails of 2022, and more importantly, I talked about how I plan to fix them in 2023 so that we do not have the same problems again next year. In this video, I'm going to talk about my 8 biggest successes of 2022, and I don't necessarily mean the things that I was most successful with. What I mean are things that I tried for the first time in 2022 that I am definitely going to do again. Think kind of experiments that paid off and were successful. So let's jump right into my 8 biggest gardening successes of 2022. Okay, the first thing that I tried in 2022 that I will definitely do again in the future is growing my tomatoes on my new trellises. Now, we installed at the beginning of this gardening season, back in the spring, my husband and I installed some new welded wire fencing trellises in our garden. Those were to grow tomatoes on, and those were incredibly successful. Our tomatoes did so well being supported on those. It saved so much space in the garden. I will definitely do that again. Now, there was something about those trellises that I am going to change. If you want to check out my previous video in this series, I talked a little bit about what did not work about those trellises, but for the most part, I am going to be using those trellises again. They were successful. I loved them. They made harvesting easier. They kept my tomato plants healthy. That was a definite win. Now, I'm about to talk about success number 2. Before we do that, I just wanted to mention that you are probably hearing some basketball noises in the background. It's a beautiful day today and my kids are outside playing basketball, so I'm not going to tell them not to play basketball when I'm shooting a video. So you get to enjoy a little slice of my real life and just hear the noises that go on in my life. So let's talk about win number 2 in the garden this year. So my second experiment in the garden this year that really paid off, this happened completely by accident. This was actually something that started off as a fail but ended up being a big win, and so I'm thankful that it happened. Now, if you were following along with me this season, you know that I had some trouble starting my cucumbers in my garden this year. I planted the seeds, and every time they sprouted, something came along and nipped the tops off every one of my plants, and it was very frustrating. So I started some more seeds in pots on my deck, and then I transplanted them to various spots. I didn't have enough space in my garden for all the cucumbers that I started, and I am just not capable of getting rid of plants. I just can't do it. So I had to find a space for the rest of the cucumber plants, and so I planted them outside my garden along the chain link fence that fences in the area where my chickens hang out, and they did so well there. That was space that wasn't really being used by anything before, and so I just decided to try growing cucumbers on it. They were so successful and they did so well that I am now going to grow cucumbers there every year, and I'm so excited because I've discovered more growing space in my yard. Now, when you have a smaller garden, you know it's kind of tricky to pack into that small space everything that you want to grow. So when you find another space where you can grow something successfully, it is such a great feeling. So along the chain link fence outside my chicken yard, I am going to be growing cucumbers from now on. And I'm hoping that that will give me an even more successful cucumber year in 2023. Now, the third experiment from 2022 that really paid off and was a big gardening win for the 2022 growing season was that I experimented with growing more varieties of plants in pots on my deck. In the past, I've pretty much only grown peppers and maybe a couple herbs on my deck because peppers really do love pots. They're a great plant to grow as a container plant. I honestly haven't had a lot of success growing other types of plants in pots, so I've just stuck with the peppers. But this year I ended up having to plant a lot of my pepper plants in the ground, which freed up a lot of pots on my deck for things other than peppers. So I used that space with a big variety of things. I planted pumpkins on my deck, I planted butternut squash on my deck, I planted beans, I planted tomatoes, I planted herbs, all kinds of plants on my deck that I don't normally grow in pots, and they were really successful. It was actually, I would say, probably my most successful container gardening year ever. In the future, while I am going to go back to growing a lot of peppers in pots on my deck, I am going to grow other plants as well. I really like the convenience of having certain plants, especially herbs or tomatoes or plants that I might need to grab for dinner, right outside my door. I can just step out in the middle of making dinner and grab what I need for dinner. That's nice and convenient. I also really like that it gave me the ability to expand my garden beyond just peppers. So I was able to grow lots of plants that I wouldn't have had space for otherwise. So I am going to continue doing that. I will definitely be continuing to grow a variety of plants in pots on my deck in the future. Now, something that I did more seriously in 2022 for the first time was mulch my tomato plants. I've kind of mulched a little bit in the past, but I haven't been really serious about it. This year in 2022, I purchased some bales of straw from my local Tractor Supply and spread them around the base of my tomato plants. And it was great. I mean, it did really well. I did have a few little spots where seeds from the straw sprouted and came up, so I had to do a little bit of extra weeding of that. But I think that the amount of sprouts that came out that I had to weed out were a lot less than the sprouts that would have come up if I hadn't weeded. And that mulch really did help conserve moisture. I noticed a few times that the ground underneath the straw really held onto its moisture a lot more efficiently than the ground that was exposed. And that was really important this year, especially because we had such a dry summer. And so I think that mulch is probably a big part of the reason why I still had a fairly successful tomato year, despite the really dry growing conditions. So I will definitely be mulching in the future. I think it kept my plants healthier. It made it easier on me not having to water. I didn't have to water as much. It also made it easier for me not having to weed as much. So I think that's a win-win. Great for the plants, great for the gardener. I will definitely be doing that again in 2023. So the fifth thing that I did this year that I kind of did for the first time that I will definitely be doing again was using tomato tape to tie up my tomatoes. Now, since I was growing them on the trellis this year, I had to come up with a way to really get them to stay attached to that trellis. Tomato plants are not natural climbers. They don't put out tendrils the way peas or cucumbers do. They don't wrap their stems around something the way beans do. So while they need to be supported, they don't really support themselves. So you need to, if you're growing them on a stake or a trellis or something like that, you need to have some way to really tie them to that stake or trellis and get them to stay upright. So I used tomato tape this year and I really liked it. It was cheap, it was easy to find, it was easy to use. The only negative is that pretty soon when my tomato plants are done for the season, I'm going to have to go out there and cut all that tape off the trellises and dispose of it. But that is a minor negative in my mind compared to all of the benefits that I found from using that tomato tape. So I will be doing that again in 2023. Now, another thing that I was successful with this year was spacing my tomato plants pretty closely. Now, just a disclaimer, how closely you're able to space your tomato plants is going to vary based on a few different factors, one of which is your growing climate. In Connecticut, it's not quite as hot and not quite as humid as it is in some other parts of the country. So if you're in like the hot and humid south, you may not be able to space your tomato plants quite as closely. Here in Connecticut, my tomato plants do still get disease every year. And honestly, I have tried spacing them farther in the past and that has not done anything to prevent disease. So I think in my growing climate, I am okay to space them fairly closely. So I spaced them probably just under 18 inches apart, which is closer than most spacing recommendations that you will see. But my tomato plants did well with it. They did get disease, but as I said before, they have gotten disease also when I have spaced them farther apart. So I don't think it made a big difference in my growing climate. I did prune them pretty heavily, not as heavily as I should have, but because I did prune, that helped increase airflow, which I think also allowed me to keep them pretty closely spaced. As I mentioned before, I do have a smaller garden, and so space is really at a premium for me. So if I'm able to plant more tomato plants more closely together and still have them be successful and productive, I am definitely going to do that. So I will be spacing them closely again in my 2023 garden. Now, number 7 isn't really a success or a win. It's kind of something that I tried this year. I didn't really get good results from. By good results, I don't mean that I had a bad result. I mean that I had inconclusive results. So I am going to try this again in 2023. So while this was not incredibly successful, there were certain reasons why I think it was not all that successful. So I am going to try to counteract those reasons and try again, and I will let you know. And that is growing more pepper plants in the ground. I mentioned before that I generally grow either most or all of my pepper plants in pots on my deck, and I have been successful with that. But I wanted to kind of experiment with growing some pepper plants in the ground this year, and I did that. But as I mentioned in my previous video, I planted my pepper plants on the wrong side of the trellis. The tomatoes really shaded them out. They did not get that much sun. And so I think that was a big part of the reason why they were not successful. So I am going to go ahead and try that again next year. I'm going to plant them on the other side of the trellis, and I'm going to hope for better success. So I will definitely let you know next growing season if that is more successful for me. Now, similarly, Number 8 is not really a true success either, but it is something that I'm going to try again next year. I think because of the bad growing conditions this summer, which were partly my fault, as I said, planting my pepper plants in the shade, and partly out of my control, which was the fact that we had very little rain this summer, and I wasn't as consistent as watering, so again, that part was my fault. But because of those bad growing conditions, I was not really able to get any meaningful results from my pepper topping experiment. If you remember at the beginning of the growing season, I topped half of my pepper plants and actually kept records of which ones I topped and which ones I didn't, so that at the end of this growing season, we could compare results to see if topping peppers really does increase production. However, pretty much all of my pepper plants, I shouldn't say all, most of my pepper plants did not do well this year because of a lot of those environmental conditions. Because of that, I was not able to really get meaningful results as to whether topping the pepper plants was successful or not. So I will be trying that again next year. Hopefully, I will be able to actually give you guys some meaningful information next year. So definitely join me next spring. We'll plant peppers again together. We'll top half of those peppers again together. And then I will do everything in my control to give those peppers the best chance possible so that we can hopefully get some actual meaningful results from that experiment next year. So I hope that you guys are encouraged to look back over the past gardening season, just see what was successful and what was not. And that can help you really going forward to the next gardening season. You want to try to recreate your successes as much as possible. So look at your successes. Why were they successful, and what can you do to recreate those successes again next year? And things that didn't really go quite right, gardening fails, or whatever you want to call them, learning experiences sounds a little better, I think. You want to not really dwell on those, but you want to learn from them and see how you can avoid duplicating those failures in the following year. And then they'll turn into a learning experience and hopefully make your garden more successful next year. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed hearing about what I did this year that I am also going to do next year, what was successful and what I'm going to give another chance to be successful next year. So I hope to see you guys again soon. I hope you're having a great day. I hope that your gardens were full of success. I hope that your success list was longer than mine. And I will see you guys again soon. All right, I'll talk to you later. All right, bye guys. I'll see you next time.